Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with another Victober video. I have recently been reading a book that I really want to talk about for Victober. It's going to seem like a very unusual video to be making during Victober because this has very little to do with the Victorian period. It is actually far more concerned with the Tudor period. A colleague of mine and I are really into the Tudors. We're just really into the history of England, and this is something that we talk about rather frequently. And she said that she had read this really interesting look into the chapel that is there at the Tower of London, which is where many of the most famous victims of Henry VIII are buried. And that chapel is the Chapel of St. Peter Ad Vincula, or St. Peter in Chains. So she recommended this book to me kind of as a primary source from the Victorian period when they were doing reconstruction on the chapel. They came across quite a few of the remains. And so this is a really interesting look at the chapel of St. Peter Ad Vincula, which is on Tower grounds. So I'm going to hopefully be able to insert a few pictures of this chapel. I have never been there, or at least I don't believe I have. I've been to the Tower of London, but I was extremely concerned with George, Duke of Clarence, who is Richard III and Edward IV's brother, and he was killed on Tower property as well, and said that he was drowned in a vat of Malmsey wine, which is what he wanted. He didn't really believe, I guess, that they were going to kill him, so when they asked him for the method of execution that he would like, he said, "Oh, drown me in my favorite wine," because I don't believe he really thought this was going to happen, and so that's what they did. So I was very concerned with finding exactly where on Tower grounds that occurred, and so that was really my main obsession when I was there at the Tower of London. So I believe I completely bypassed this chapel, unfortunately, but I did see the spot where the most famous executions occurred, and the chapel is very close to there. So there is a monument there on Tower Green for the main, I believe, 8 that were killed there, kind of inside the tower. Many people were executed at the tower, but they weren't executed inside. So these are people who were really well off and kind of could afford this, or deserved, I guess is maybe the right word, deserved a more private execution. So the people like Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Jane Grey, they were all executed on this spot. And so I believe kind of immediately after the execution of these individuals, their remains were then taken and placed in this chapel. And so interestingly, during the Victorian period, which is when this text was written, Victoria was very interested in getting the chapel renovated. I think mainly the reason that they called it St. Peter Ad Vincula, which is St. Peter in Chains. There is another church called St. Peter Ad Vincula, but it's in Rome. And so it's kind of thought that it was probably given this name because it would have been the chapel for the prisoners there in the Tower of London. From what this book states, I believe Victoria was interested in kind of rehabilitating its image and making it a more functional church, kind of for the neighborhood that surrounds the Tower of London. And so people went in and were evaluating this chapel, and they decided that quite a bit of it needed to be worked on. And in particular, the floor needed to be worked on. The floor was very, very hollow, and it was kind of tilting in certain places, because the interesting thing is that people continued to be buried in this chapel up until the Victorian period. It was a place that people just in the neighborhood who lived around the Tower of London, it is a place where they might also have been buried. And so over the course of time, people who were buried in the floor there in the chapel were probably not buried the best, let's say. They weren't placed with enough earth around them. The earth was not packed hard enough, and so there was space between their remains, or their coffin, and the floor of the church, which means that over the centuries, as the church settled, the floor got uneven and it became rather dangerous. And so that was something that was of major concern to the renovators when they went in, was making sure that the floor was even and that the floor was safe. They were also, of course, really interested in taking the chapel back to its Tudor heyday and allowing it to really look like a medieval or Tudor structure. So they were taking away all of the modern additions in the church as well. But the floor is what's interesting here, because that is, of course, where everyone is buried. Here is the map of the Tower of London that is in this edition of the book. So this is the map of the Tower of London at the time. So these renovations were going on in the 1870s. But prior to getting into the discoveries that were made by the renovators, I thought I would tell you just a little bit about the chapel itself. So this is, I believe, the only chapel in the Tower of London. And it is a medieval structure. It is thought that it probably came about during Henry I's time. So maybe not when the White Tower was built, which is the most famous kind of building inside the Tower of London. You'll know it. It's got the 4 little towers around it. That was built by William the Conqueror. And so it's thought that the original St. Peter Ad Vincula was likely built by Henry I. But it's probably more likely the structure that you see today comes from the time of King Edward I. So this is the late 1200s. And I do like that the first chapter of the book says, with the exception of the Abbey Church of St. Peter's at Westminster, there is no ecclesiastical edifice in the United Kingdom in which, so far as it has been used as a place of sepulchre, is centered so much historical interest as the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London. Within its walls have been received the mortal remains of many, whose names, though not recorded on the stones of its pavement, must yet ever live in the pages of English history. So the present church likely dates from the later 1200s, as I said, but it was added on extensively during Henry VIII's time. Henry VIII paid a lot of attention to this because the tower had been a place of royal residence quite a bit in the centuries before. And so during Henry VIII's, Elizabeth I's reign, the tower kind of transitions from a place of royal residence to a place where we are keeping prisoners. And as you might can imagine, during the dissolution of the monasteries that happened later in Henry VIII's reign, the chapel underwent quite a bit of change. It did have a bishop at one time. It no longer does. It still doesn't have a bishop, actually. According to this book, it didn't in the Victorian age because of the dissolution of the monasteries and moving towards the Anglican Church away from the Catholic Church. So it's really an interesting building in its own right, because prior to the Tower of London becoming known as this really big place where we keep our prisoners before we execute them, this was a place of royal residence, so the royal family would come there and stay. So you can imagine that a lot of medieval kings and queens went into this chapel. Probably quite a few of the most famous prisoners did as well. So this is just really an interesting building in its own right without taking into account all of the famous burials there. But it's stated that in the Victorian period, in the 19th century anyway, this has kind of become less than a special chapel. It's really less than a special church. It's just very average because it has been allowed to be updated in such a way that a lot of its charm has been lost. And so Charles Macaulay, who was really famous for writing a history of England, has this really interesting quote from when he visited the chapel. I cannot refrain from expressing my disgust at the barbarous stupidity which has transformed this interesting little church into the likeness of a meeting house in a manufacturing town. In truth, there is no sadder spot on earth than this little cemetery. Death is there associated, not, as in Westminster's and St. Paul's, with genius and virtue, with public veneration and with imperishable renown. Not, as in our humblest churches and churchyards, with everything that is most endearing in social and domestic charities, but with whatever is darkest in human nature and in human destiny, with the savage triumph of implacable enemies, with the inconstancy, the ingratitude, the cowardice of friends, with all the miseries of fallen greatness and of blighted fame. Thither have been carried through successive ages by the rude hands of jailers without one mourner following, the bleeding relics of men who had been the captains of armies, the leaders of parties, the oracles of senates, and the ornaments of courts. Which is a really, really beautiful quote and makes me want to read Macaulay's History of England like right now, if I can be promised more prose like that. So prior to the renovations, this is what the chapel looked like. So this is something that they were kind of looking to change. And here it is when the chapel has been restored. So the work was done over a year, and you can see how they changed the windows. I think in particular that made the biggest difference to me, is that they went back towards a more medieval window style, which I think is really, really beautiful. Before getting into the burials, I want to show you this burial chart that he included in here. So the person who was writing this book, whose name I don't believe I mentioned, he's called Doyne Courtney Bell. He decided to kind of go over the archives and meet with a lot of people who worked in the tower, go over historical records to make sure that they weren't unnecessarily disturbing graves during this process, and also just so that they knew what the original chapel looked like, so they could, when they renovated it, try to make it match the original as closely as possible. And so I believe he turned up this burial plan. So up at the top here we have the altar, and then we're kind of moving towards the back of the church as we read down. So you can see they knew kind of in a precise location where everybody was before they started the renovations. You might have heard in that first quote that I read, the opening paragraph of the book, that they didn't actually mark the graves in this church. Record was kept of where everybody was buried, but there was no monument made. So when the renovators came in, they knew there were certain areas of the church that they really did not want to touch because they did not want to disturb certain graves. And so in particular, they knew there was an area of the church where Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's two wives that were beheaded, are buried, and they really did not want to disturb this area of the church. But that is unfortunately a place where the floor was kind of concave and falling in. Something they uncovered throughout this process is that most of these graves had already been disturbed because, as I said, graves kept on being added over the centuries. People continued to be buried there, kind of willy-nilly. Just if you lived in the neighborhood, you could possibly get buried there. And so they did as they did with a lot of different graves at this time, and they moved remains around to make room for the next person to be added in. And so that is something that happened with Anne Boleyn. So they take up the floor in the area where they know Anne Boleyn is thought to have been, and she is kind of arranged in a small pile. She is not kind of laid out the way that she would have been for the initial burial. So it's thought that probably 100 years prior to this, so in the 1700s, she was likely moved around a little bit. I'm going to read to you this passage about when they found these bones. At this depth, the bones of a female were found, not lying in the original order, but which had evidently for some reason or other been heaped together into a smaller space. All these bones were examined by Dr. Moust, who at once pronounced them to be those of a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, and they bore witness to the queen's little neck. He thought that these female bones had lain in the earth for upwards of 300 years, and they were certainly all those of one person. No other female bones were found on this spot. Not much doubt existed in the minds of those present that these were the remains of Anne Boleyn, who was recorded to have been buried in front of the altar by the side of her brother George. So a couple of things here. If you're a big fan of Anne Boleyn, you know she was 36 when she died. So it's kind of interesting that he says between 25 and 30. That's pretty funny to me. But there is also the allusion to the Queen's little neck. This is something that Anne Boleyn kind of famously quipped before her execution. Well, the headsman will make easy work of me. I have such a small neck. And so apparently medically she did in fact have a little neck. This is the most exciting part of the book to me. And I wouldn't consider myself the greatest Anne Boleyn fan. I do really like her, but I thought this was really, really fascinating. Interestingly, I'll clue you in about George. They don't find him in this, so they're kind of assuming that either his remains were moved at some point or they were recorded as being in the wrong place, and so he's possibly buried elsewhere in the chapel. So they only really concern themselves with the floor that needed to be redone. They didn't actually take up the entire floor. They didn't see all of the remains that are there. So it's possible that George is there. They just didn't confirm this. They think that he was likely buried in a different place in the church, but was labeled as being near Anne. 2 sets of male bones were found near Anne Boleyn, and they believe that those were the Protector Somerset and John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, because it was recorded that they were buried between the 2 queens, Anne and Catherine. In the same area, they find the remains of a much older woman, thought to be in her 70s, who would be Margaret, Countess of Salisbury. And so she is the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, who I was hunting after so hard in the Tower. And I really should have been looking for her because she was his daughter. And she is one of the most famous executions of Henry VIII. And she was executed when she was very, very old. And the headsman was not very good. He didn't have a very sharp blade. It took at least 3 tries for him to take her head off. Is that not terrible to think about? She truly had a terrible death. And she was really imprisoned for, of course, political reasons, ties to the old regime during the Wars of the Roses. And it's thought that her sons, of course, conspired to want the throne after Henry VIII and to take the throne back into Plantagenet hands, and that she may have aided them. So that's essentially what happened to her. Hers is a very, very interesting story, a really sad story. Her life in its entirety was sad. But they did find her, which is really exciting. But they did not really find Catherine Howard. So it's said that she would have been in the same area. So she, Margaret, Anne Boleyn, and Lady Rochford, who was George's wife, the wife of George Boleyn, Anne's brother, she would have been there as well because she was executed at the same time as Catherine Howard. They found her, they found Margaret, but nothing was ever found that could be confirmed as Catherine Howard's remains. And this is really interesting, so I'm going to read this passage as well. No remains which could be identified as those of Queen Catherine Howard were found. It should, however, be borne in mind that lime has been most extensively used in these interments, and as Catherine Howard was only 20 years old when she was beheaded, at which age the bones had not become hard and consolidated, it is very possible that even when Judge Jeffreys was interred in the chancel, which is something that happened, I believe, in the 1600s, her remains had already become dust. So they believe that her remains were down there, but because of the use of lime, they disintegrated. So that's very interesting to me. I don't know if that's true or not. A lot of this I was going back and forth on because the Victorian science is probably not the science of today, as you might can imagine. So I'm kind of curious as to whether or not their findings are based on true scientific fact that we should still believe today. Like, is that true that at age 20 your bones are still developing? I believe it's true. So she would have been more susceptible to the lime. But then when you think about it, Anne Boleyn, well, I guess Anne Boleyn was 36. So I've just solved that for myself. She was, in fact, much older than Catherine Howard when she was beheaded. But I was thinking there had to have been somebody else buried there in the same age range that they found. But I don't believe that's true. They did take these remains out and place them in lead coffins for the duration of the renovations, and then they placed them back where they found them after the renovations were complete before they put the new floor in. So they had time to do some medical analysis on some of these bones, which I think is really fascinating. Unfortunately, some of the more famous names that are buried in the chapel, aside from Anne Boleyn and Margaret, the Countess of Salisbury, they didn't really interfere with, which is probably a good thing. But we don't have anything on, say, Sir Thomas More, St. Thomas More. We don't have anything on, I believe, Thomas Cromwell is buried in there, which I think would have been really fascinating, or Jane Grey. So this is just really interesting. They tried not to disturb any of the graves, but those that they did, they decided to make some real interesting scientific observations about. So I thought that I would tell you a little bit of the doctor's descriptions of the bones. For Queen Anne Boleyn, the bones found in the place where Queen Anne Boleyn is said to have been buried are certainly those of a female in the prime of life, all perfectly consolidated and symmetrical, and they belong to the same person. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hand and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. They are all consistent with the published descriptions of the queen, and the bones of the skull might well belong to the person portrayed in the painting by Holbein in the collection of the Earl of Warwick. Of Anne, they found the frontal bone tolerably complete, showing a forehead moderate in height and a fair breadth, orbits large, superciliary ridge straight, a large portion of the occipital bone in excellent preservation, several portions of the parietal bones in good condition. I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly. Fragments of both temporal bones, much eroded. The lower jaw, 2/3 perfect. The other third on the left side was broken off and not found. 8 teeth remaining in the jaw. 4 more teeth found loose. They had just fallen out, all in excellent preservation. 1 molar tooth of the left side was slightly decayed, which is really interesting. The form of the head appears to have been round and the face of an oval shape. The forehead straight and ample and denoting considerable intelligence. The lower part of the face, judging from the form of the jaw, must have been moderately full with a somewhat square chin. They do have the vertebrae, the atlas, very small, much eroded, 3 dorsal vertebrae, possibly the first and the third, 3 lumbar vertebrae. Judging from these vertebrae, her height might have been about 5 feet or 5 feet 3 inches, but no more. 4 ribs tolerably perfect, the rest fragmentary in 52 pieces. The collarbone and clavicle, the left side was perfect, a small portion of the right clavicle only remaining. 2 fragments of the head of the scapula on the left side were found. Judging from the curvature of the ribs, she must have had a deep and well-formed chest. Why did we need to hear this, Dr. Mawat? We didn't need to. 8 fragments of the pelvis very much eroded and the character almost obliterated. Portions of both legs, the left thigh bone in tolerably good preservation, though broken off above, is singularly delicate and well formed. Several portions of the tibia and fibula of both legs. The kneecap of the left leg was found very perfect. Her limbs evidently bore a due proportion to the rest of her body. Portions of the humerus and radius of the right side, the radius is remarkably slender. 11 finger bones, but the phalanx of them. So I was really shocked when I saw 11 finger bones, and I was like, oh my gosh, that rumor about Anne's 6th finger. But he just means, in general, a bone from the finger, not complete fingers. There were 52 other fragments very much eroded and not susceptible of exact identification. For Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, the bones believed to be those of Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, are all those of a tall and aged female, and she would have been tall because when you think about Edward IV was an extremely tall guy for the late medieval period. He was something like 6'4", and so I believe George was rather tall too, her father, so she was always talked about as being a very tall woman. So to me, this is confirmation that this is absolutely her. They found her skull, a considerable portion of the frontal bone with the left orbit, petrous portion of the temporal bone, and 2 small fragments of the side of the skull. The upper portion of the sternum or breastbone, tolerably perfect, 6 fragments of ribs, 2 portions of the pelvis, portions of the radius of both arms in good preservation, portions of both clavicles, 1 dorsal and 3 lumbar vertebrae, 2 fibula nearly complete, 1 finger bone, a portion of the humerus. Most of these bones in tolerable condition, but some eroded by lime. The use of lime is just really interesting to me. So apparently it did affect those who were executed at a later date than Anne Boleyn. So apparently if it did completely dissolve Catherine Howard's bones, it also really affected Margaret, the Countess of Salisbury's. So I just don't know that the age of the bones had anything to do with it. I think it just had to do with the fact that they were using lime. So that is just really, really fascinating. I have found this book very fascinating so far. They've talked about the monuments in the church. This really just takes you through the chapel as a whole. The guy writing this was very interested in documenting the renovations because he believed he had done a lot of really important historical research, which is true. And he also wanted to convey the research that had been done during the renovation, especially regarding finding these remains and rehousing them. So sections of the book talk about the monuments there, the history of the chapel, and their discoveries during the renovation and the changes that they were trying to make during the renovation. So that might be a drier portion of the book to you if you're reading it, but I found it quite fascinating because I find church architecture very interesting. But if you don't, this may not really interest you in certain parts. And then here towards the end of the book, which is what I'm currently in, are all of the biographical notices of people who were buried there. So they have information about all of the burials, not just those that they discovered and they went over. But I thought I would end this with another quote from the book, and it says, "In any building, even in Westminster Abbey, it would be difficult to point to a spot where can be seen so closely grouped together more remarkable names than those which are inscribed on the memorial tablets in this chancel pavement. Names which must awaken many singular personal as well as historical associations, and which cannot fail to bring to mind not only stirring episodes in the lives of those who were there recorded, but also to recall many critical scenes and events in the history of our country in which they have been the chief actors." So this has been a really great read thus far, and I am looking forward to reading through the biographical notices. This is really fascinating, and if you are at all interested in the Tudor period, I think that you should pick this up because it does answer a lot of questions. There are a lot of famous names, people who were executed on Tower Green, people like Sir Walter Raleigh, who were not interred in this church, and so it tells you where they are if you would like to go see them. I just think this is a really interesting source, a really interesting primary source from the Victorian period. It is something that I believe you can only get print on demand, which is what I did. So I will link to my edition down below. I ordered it from Amazon, but if you were interested in this, I do highly recommend it. So this was a pretty different Victober video, but I hope that you enjoyed it. If you are somebody who is really into Anne Boleyn or just the Tudor period in general, I would love to know down below. This was just a really fascinating read to me because I really think things like this are very, very interesting. Some people may find this very morbid, but I think this is needed in historical research. So this has been just a really fascinating read thus far, and I thought I would update y'all on it. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.